Iran corridor. The satellite phone call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. It was routed through a commercial relay network, compressed, partially encrypted using a consumer-grade protocol, and transmitted across a path that crossed 4 countries before reaching its destination. By the standard metrics of signals collection, it was not a sophisticated communication. It was, in fact, the kind of call that a cartel logistics coordinator might make without giving much thought to interception risk. Brief, businesslike, using a handset that had been in operation for less than a week and would be discarded shortly after. NSA Cyber's automated collection systems flagged the call not because of its content, which was still encrypted at the point of initial detection, but because of where it went. The destination routing, the path the signal traveled after leaving the relay network, terminated at a satellite infrastructure node associated with communications architecture that NSA Cyber had been monitoring for 14 months as part of a separate investigation into Iranian state-connected external operations in the Western Hemisphere. A cartel logistics phone calling into Iranian state-connected satellite infrastructure was not a combination that the collection system had encountered before. It was the kind of anomaly that does not resolve into a routine explanation. The call was logged, flagged at the highest priority level, and queued for immediate analyst attention. Within 6 hours, the analyst assigned to the flag had pulled every piece of associated collection data available. The signal path, the handset's prior transmission history, the destination node's known associations, and every other call or data transmission that had intersected with either endpoint in the previous 30 days. What that initial collection review produced was not an answer. It was a set of questions that suggested the answer, when found, would be significant. NSA Cyber assigned a dedicated collection and analytical team to what was internally designated as the Iron Corridor investigation. The team's initial mandate was to establish the full scope of the communications relationship that the flagged satellite phone call suggested, to determine whether this was an isolated contact or evidence of an ongoing operational relationship between cartel infrastructure and Iranian state-connected external operations. The answer to that foundational question arrived within 3 weeks and was unambiguous. It was not an isolated contact. It was one data point in a communications architecture that had been operating at the point of detection for approximately 26 months. The communications architecture was layered and deliberately fragmented. No single channel carried the full operational picture. Satellite phone contacts established initial coordination and time-sensitive operational updates. Encrypted radio transmissions on frequencies monitored by the team carried logistics details and confirmation codes. A third layer, encrypted data transmissions routed through a series of commercial infrastructure providers in ways designed to obscure the signal path's true origin and destination, carried what the team assessed as the operational planning and financial documentation layer of the relationship. Breaking into all 3 layers required different technical approaches in different time frames. The satellite phone layer was the most accessible. NSA Cyber's existing collection infrastructure against the Iranian connected destination node provided a foundation for the cryptographic work, and the satellite phone traffic was yielding decoded content within 8 weeks. The radio frequency layer took 4 months. The encrypted data transmission layer, the most technically sophisticated component of the architecture, required 6 months of sustained cryptographic effort before the first decoded content began coming through. The complete picture did not assemble itself at once. It developed incrementally as each layer yielded its content, each decoded message adding context to what the previously decoded layers had suggested. By the time the data transmission layer was fully penetrated, and 26 months of historical traffic across all 3 communication layers was available for analysis, the NSA Cyber team had spent the better part of 9 months building toward a briefing that, when it was delivered to senior leadership, produced the kind of silence that falls over a room when people are absorbing something that is simultaneously expected and worse than expected. What 26 months of decoded communications across 3 separate channels documented was a structured operational partnership between a senior logistics and territorial command element of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and a procurement and external operations unit connected to the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The partnership was not a recent development. The decoded message's earliest content suggested that the relationship had been established through intermediary contacts in Venezuela, approximately 3.5 years before NSA Cyber's initial detection, meaning the full operational history extended back roughly 4 years. From the point the team had assembled the complete picture, the partnership's operational architecture, as reconstructed from decoded communications across all 3 channels, was built around a fundamental exchange. The cartel provided 3 things: established smuggling infrastructure along the Arizona and Texas border corridors capable of moving physical cargo of significant volume across the USA border without detection, distribution and cash handling networks in the United States capable of receiving, storing and moving physical goods through domestic supply chains, and territorial protection and operational security for Iranian-connected personnel and materials moving through cartel-controlled regions of northern Mexico. In exchange, the Iranian-connected procurement unit provided weapon systems. The weapon systems documented in decoded communications were not the standard small arms that characterize most cartel armament operations. The decoded messages documented the transfer and operational deployment of systems that had not previously been confirmed in any NSA Cyber case file as present in cartel inventory. Specifically, military-grade anti-armor weapon systems of a type associated with Iranian state military procurement and export. Precision-capable drone platforms of a category that the analytical team assessed as consistent with systems developed or modified by Iranian defense entities for asymmetric warfare applications. Electronic warfare equipment capable of disrupting law enforcement radio communications over limited geographic areas. And in 3 cases documented in decoded communications with particular operational specificity, improvised explosive systems constructed using components and design configurations associated with Iranian state-sponsored IED programs documented in other theater operations. The scale of the weapons transfer program documented in 26 months of decoded communications was, by any measure applicable to cartel armament, extraordinary. The decoded messages documented 34 discrete transfer events, physical movements of weapons and equipment from Iranian-connected supply chains through the cartel's northern Mexico territory to delivery points accessible to cartel operational units. The transfers ranged in size from small consignments of specialized components to 3 large volume movements that the decoded coordination messages described in terms suggesting shipments of substantial weight and physical dimension. Total estimated value of weapons and equipment transferred based on the pricing and quantity references in decoded financial coordination messages was between $180 million and $240 million over the documented period. The cartel's side of the exchange, the border corridor access provided to Iranian-connected operational requirements, was documented in a separate thread of decoded communications that the team assessed as the more immediately alarming dimension of the partnership. Over 26 months of decoded communications, the cartel's border corridor infrastructure had been used to move Iranian-connected cargo across the U.S. border on at least 19 documented occasions. The decoded messages' descriptions of this cargo were not always explicit. In 11 of the 19 documented movements, the cargo was described in general terms: weight, volume, handling requirements, without specific identification of contents. In 6 cases, the cargo was described in terms consistent with communications equipment and technical hardware. In 2 cases, decoded messages described cargo in terms that the analytical team assessed as consistent with precursor materials for weapons or explosive systems. The 19th documented movement was described in language explicit enough to require no interpretation. A coordination message confirmed the successful delivery of what it called operational materials of primary category to a receiving contact at a location in the Phoenix metropolitan area. The Phoenix delivery, the one documented border crossing where the decoded communications were most explicit about cargo nature, had occurred 14 months before NSA Cyber's initial detection of the Iron Corridor architecture. Its receiving contact had never been identified through any other investigative channel. It was, at the time, the team reviewed it in the context of the full decoded communications picture 14 months cold. The materials described as delivered were, according to the communication that confirmed their receipt, already in transit toward an unstated final destination when the confirmation message was sent. This was the finding that produced the most urgent response in the senior leadership briefing. Not the weapons transfers to the cartel, significant as those were. Not the border corridor access being sold to Iranian operational requirements, alarming as that was. The Phoenix delivery 14 months prior with materials of primary category now at an unknown location inside the United States was the thread that generated immediate counterterrorism response protocols in parallel with the broader operational planning. NSA Cyber shared the Phoenix delivery intelligence with the FBI's counterterrorism division within hours of the senior briefing. The 14-month-old delivery became a separate highest priority investigation running concurrently with the broader Iron Corridor response. Every decoded message thread that touched on the Phoenix delivery was extracted and provided to FBI analysts. Every contact designation, location reference, and operational term in those messages was cross-referenced against existing FBI holdings. The investigation into the Phoenix delivery's downstream trail, where the materials had gone after receipt, what they were, who had been involved in their movement, became one of the most resource-intensive counterterrorism investigative efforts of the period. The broader Iron Corridor operational response was constructed around a timeline trigger that had emerged from the decoded communications in the weeks immediately preceding the senior briefing. A series of coordination messages between the cartel command element and the Iranian connected procurement unit documented the preparation of what the messages called the consolidated exchange. The largest single transfer event in the documented history of the partnership. The consolidated exchange involved a weapons shipment of a scale substantially larger than any of the 34 previously documented transfers, and a simultaneous border corridor operation moving Iranian connected cargo that the decoded messages described with unusual operational emphasis as priority materials with direct authorization from Coordination Center. The consolidated exchange was scheduled to execute within 22 days of the coordination messages being decoded. NSA Cyber escalated the complete intelligence package through priority interagency channels. The FBI received both the counterterrorism thread and the organized crime dimensions of the package. The DEA's Special Operations Division was brought in for the cartel's structural intelligence. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives received the weapons transfer documentation. The most detailed forensic intelligence on cartel heavy weapons acquisition that the agency had ever been provided from signals intelligence sources. The Department of Homeland Security's National Security Investigations Unit was read in for the border corridor operations documentation. Given the explicit Iranian state connection and the presence of weapon systems associated with IRGC external operations programs, the intelligence was shared with the National Counterterrorism Center and the CIA's Iran Operations Division. International partners in Mexico were engaged through the established Merida Initiative law enforcement cooperation framework. Mexican federal authorities received actionable intelligence on cartel personnel and locations identified through decoded communications, without exposure to the collection methods that had produced it. The sensitivity of the source intelligence was the highest operational concern throughout the interagency coordination process. The Iron Corridor communications architecture remained active and productive throughout the planning period, and protecting that access until the operational window required it to be burned was a priority that shaped every decision about what intelligence to share, with whom and in what form. In the operational plan developed by the multi-agency task force over 16 days addressed 4 simultaneous objectives. The first was the interdiction of the consolidated exchange, preventing both the weapons shipment and the priority materials border movement from completing. The second was the disruption of the cartel command element's operational infrastructure across its northern Mexico territory. The third was the seizure of as much of the previously transferred weapons inventory as possible, based on storage location intelligence extracted from decoded logistics coordination messages. The fourth, the most complex and the one with the longest operational tail, was the continuation and acceleration of the investigation into the Phoenix delivery and its downstream trail. The interdiction operations began on day 18 of the 22-day window, 4 days before the consolidated exchange's scheduled execution. Mexican federal forces, acting on decoded communications location intelligence, identified and interdicted the weapons shipment component of the consolidated exchange at a staging facility in southern Sonora. The facility, which decoded logistics messages had identified as the primary pre-crossing consolidation point for the cartel's northern corridor weapons storage, yielded a weapons inventory that exceeded the interdicting force's pre-operation estimates. Recovered systems included 17 complete anti-armor weapons launchers with associated munitions, 43 drone platforms ranging from commercial-size modified units to larger military category systems with precision guidance components, electronic warfare equipment consistent with descriptions in decoded technical specification messages, and a quantity of IED construction components that the analytical team assessed as sufficient for several dozen devices of the type documented in decoded construction guidance communications. The border corridor component of the consolidated exchange, the priority materials movement, was interdicted at the crossing point identified in decoded logistics coordination messages by a joint CBP and federal law enforcement operation. The materials recovered in the interdiction were assessed by technical specialists at the scene and subsequently at federal laboratory facilities. The assessment results confirmed the analytical team's most concerning interpretation of the decoded message's description. The priority materials were components associated with the construction of a system capable of causing casualties on a scale inconsistent with standard cartel operational requirements, and consistent with the type of capability that an Iranian state-connected external operations program would have reason to move into U.S. unawed territory. The cartel command element's operational infrastructure disruption involved coordinated raids across 7 locations in Sonora and Jalisco, conducted by Mexican federal forces with U.S. federal advisory and intelligence support. The operations resulted in 41 arrests, including 3 individuals identified in decoded communications as holding senior positions in the cartel command element's logistics and territorial operations. Financial records, communications devices, and physical documentation recovered from raided locations provided investigators with substantial additional forensic material to expand the investigation beyond the individuals and locations already identified through signals intelligence. The investigation into the Phoenix delivery continued as a separate operational thread. The decoded communications intelligence combined with forensic evidence recovered from the consolidated exchange interdiction and the raided cartel locations gave investigators a significantly more detailed understanding of the delivery's logistics chain than had been available from the decoded messages alone. Within 3 weeks of the Iron Corridor operational phase, federal investigators had developed active investigative leads in 3 states connected to the Phoenix delivery's downstream movement. Within 6 weeks, the materials described in the Phoenix delivery confirmation message had been located and secured. The 26 months of decoded communications across 3 separate channel layers Satellite phone traffic, radio frequency transmissions, and encrypted data communications had produced the most comprehensive documented picture of Iranian state-connected weapons supply to cartel organizations in the Western Hemisphere that NSA Cyber's analytical holdings contained. The picture documented 4 years of structured operational partnership, $180 to $240 million in weapons transfers, 19 confirmed border corridor operations moving Iranian-connected cargo into U.S. territory, and a consolidated exchange of sufficient scale and operational sensitivity that it had been authorized at a level the decoded messages described as the coordination center. None of it was supposed to be readable. The 3-layer communications architecture had been designed with the specific intent of making comprehensive collection impossible. If one layer was penetrated, the others would remain intact, each requiring separate technical effort to address. The designers of that architecture had calculated correctly that penetrating all 3 layers would be difficult. They had not calculated that NSA Cyber would invest the 9 months of sustained effort required to do it anyway. The satellite phone call that opened the investigation lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. It was made without sophistication, on a handset that its user expected to discard in days, routed through infrastructure that its user believed would obscure its destination. The destination was not obscured. The call was collected, flagged, and became the thread that NSA Cyber pulled for 9 months until everything connected to it was visible. 4 minutes and 11 seconds was enough. The Iron Corridor ran for 4 years across 3 communication channels in 4 countries, moving weapons into cartel hands and Iranian-connected materials across the U.S. border, protected by encryption its operators trusted absolutely. NSA Cyber trusted the signals. The signals were right. This is a fictional dramatization inspired by signal intelligence and cyber operations concepts. No real cases, individuals, specific methods, or NSA operations are depicted. All characters, organizations, operational details, events, and geopolitical scenarios described are entirely fictitious and are used solely for narrative and illustrative purposes.